Okay, so today what I'm going to do is answer the question whether the so-called refugee crisis caused the rise of populism. The reason why is because the whole topic of the rise of populism is relatively recent. And while populism itself is a concept that goes back quite a while ago, until probably the beginning of the 21st century, it was not used very much. And even, I would say, until the Great Recession of 2008, it was a not very often used concept, or it was more within the debate of the radical right. Particularly over the last couple of years, the rise of populism has been the theme in academia, but also in the media. And obviously, this is very much related to developments in the two Anglo-Saxon powers, because they define what international media write about. But it was also, to a large extent, overlapping with what is called the refugee crisis. And much of the coverage of the refugee crisis has linked the two. Now, the refugee crisis, let me see whether, oh, it wasn't on yet. There we go. That was me. So we're pretty familiar probably with what the so-called refugee crisis is, and I will leave the so-called out. I just want to make clear that refugee crisis is a political term. The fact that it is determined to be a crisis is a value statement. It's not an objective situation, and to a large extent, it was made into a crisis. It was redefined as a crisis because of political activities. Therefore, I'm very reluctant to let the term stand by itself, while at the same time acknowledging that in the end, what we were dealing with was a refugee crisis, because the way it was dealt and defined was as such. So this is an overview, most importantly, of some of the numbers that gives you an indication. Let's see whether I can beam that. Obviously, you guys are here. You win. Well, yeah, my country's here, doing very little. But most importantly are these arrows, right? The most important thing about the whole structure of the refugee crisis is that it affected the whole EU, but very disproportionately on certain areas. Most importantly, while massive numbers came in pretty much through two areas, Italy and Greece, virtually none of them wanted to be there. Right? And most importantly, there were always, as has been the case now for decades, three main destinations: Germany, always number one, Sweden, and the UK. However, they came through countries that so far have seen very few asylum seekers. And on top of that, of course, they came within the structure of the European Union, which has the Schengen area, which doesn't have the traditional borders. This is another overview of the disproportionality of the roughly 1.5 million asylum seekers that came into Europe in 2015. Now what you see is, again, Germany being very big, but also Hungary being very big, and of course Hungary is going to play a big role in this story. And here you see that it's actually Hungary that has the highest percentage of, highest number of asylum applications per citizen, Sweden very high, and then Austria also very high. In that terms, like Germany is a bit lower. I'm not going to speak too much about the ins and outs of the refugee crisis, the key point is that it was linked to the Syrian civil war, but sizable portions of the asylum seekers came from different countries as well. Syria, Iraq are number one, but then Eritrea and Ethiopia as well as Afghanistan are very high. There's also, of course, the Syrian civil war didn't start in 2015. And so this wasn't necessarily a big surprise. They hadn't come in these numbers, but they had come to many other countries. And actually what we see is that part of these asylum seekers do not come directly from Syria. They come from relatively horrible situations in bordering countries, including Lebanon and Jordan, which have taken in the brunt of these asylum seekers. So did that so-called refugee crisis create the rise of populism? And the answer very academically is it's complicated. The two things that are most important to the narrative of the rise of populism are Brexit and Trump, which is accidentally wrong because neither is a very good example of populism, because populism played only one part of a role. And so Brexit, like this is the famous poster of Nigel Farage of UKIP, Breaking Point, like, in which Nigel Farage and UKIP at the end of the Brexit referendum made immigration the key issue. And that was linked to the refugee crisis, a picture from Slovenia, where refugees were walking to Austria. It played a role, but the whole Brexit referendum predates the refugee crisis by many years and was about EU membership, which had only partly to do with immigration, and most of that immigration was intra-European immigration. It was about Romanians and Bulgarians, not about Syrians and Afghani. Trump, even less, when there are virtually no refugees from Syria coming into the US. And obviously, you can't walk from Syria to the US. And so it's a much more controlled process. That said, the US had a very nasty debate about allowing asylum seekers from Muslim-majority countries. And so this, what we now call the Muslim ban, which is linked to Trump, actually predates Trump and was supported by a majority of Republican governors already before. However, the rise of left-wing populism, and I'm talking about Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain, which was a hot topic in 2015, just before the crisis, is unrelated to it. Actually, both Podemos and Syriza are probably the most pro-asylum seeker parties in their countries. So what we're talking about is what I call the populist radical right, and what you sometimes call right-wing populism or radical right. I'll explain why I use that term. And they partly predate the refugee crisis. And so let me explain how that works. What the so-called refugee crisis did was create a perfect storm for the populist radical right, because it created a narrative that linked to the three core issues of the populist radical right, which are nativism, authoritarianism, and populism. And this is the way that was done. So first, nativism. Nativism is by and large xenophobic nationalism. And it can be best summarized through an infamous slogan of the early 1990s, related to another asylum seeker period, which was Deutschland den Deutschen Ausländer raus. That is nativism. Your country is for your own natives only, and all the non-native should stay out. Now, when you have aliens non-natives overrunning or swamping your country, as became the discourse during the so-called refugee crisis, then obviously that relates directly to nativism. But it gives the impression that your country cannot protect its own borders, which is at the core of a nativist interpretation of politics, but also to a certain extent of what we consider to be crucial to a state. On top of that, the majority of the refugees and asylum seekers are Muslims, which is within contemporary nativist discourse kind of the ultimate alien. The Muslim is defined as being fundamentally alien to native society. Right? Allegedly, the Muslim stands for values that are directly juxtaposed to Western values. So if you are swamped, because that's the discourse that was used in all kind of newspapers, not just tabloids, by aliens who are on top of that kind of the uber threat to your nation, your civilization, then clearly that raises the bar on nativism. And that makes it very good for populist radical right to respond to that, because they have that answer. Because they've always said that the country should be only for our own people and everyone else is a threat. But it also links to authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, not in the sense of the democratization literature where it is seen as non-democracy, but in a more social psychological interpretation, where authoritarianism is a view of society where you want order, and you think that chaos is the biggest threat. And so you want to achieve that order through two ways. First, through kind of education, through creating discipline in people, and second, through strict law and order, to make sure that you have very strict laws, and any infringement upon that law will be punished severely, which means more police, higher sentences, those kind of things. In this world where pretty much everything is a law and order issue, then obviously immigration is a law and order issue as well. But nativists intrinsically link refugees to crime. And of course we saw that in some of the worst media things, the way that there was a report about asylum seekers was very much with a link to crime, and we all, particularly you here in Germany, remember the way that the media covered the New Year's Eve celebrations in Cologne in particular, though also in some other cities, where groups of aliens, non-natives, had sexually and otherwise harassed German women, which means white women, and that leads to this artistically very creative, but obviously highly problematic and racist cover of what is a progressive quality newspaper. But also the refugee crisis coincided with an increase in terrorism in Western Europe. And see, it coincided because they happened at the same time. To a certain extent, the terrorism wave preceded the so-called refugee crisis. And the most important terrorist attack, probably for our public debate, was in January 2015 in Paris, the attack on Charlie Hebdo, which is this left-wing satirical magazine which had provoked all kinds of groups, including Muslims, and two jihadi terrorists attacked it, killed most of the people there. It had a massive, massive impact. I mean, everyone was Charlie, Je suis Charlie, right? It was the big hashtag, and it was all over the place, predated this. And actually the response to that, interestingly enough, was not nativist. The response to that was everyone from around the world going to Paris, joining arms, and walking in support of multiculturalism. Now that was a bit gone later because the terrorist attacks continued, and increasingly there was a link made between refugees and terrorists in the political and public debates. I give you a German example, Seehofer, who already on the evening of one of the attacks implied that there was a link between the two, even though that even to date, that link is very problematic. At the very least, the vast majority of the terrorists that were part of these attacks were born and raised in Europe. And only very few came through the refugee flow, of whom several were not even refugees. They were actually Europeans coming back from Syria. But that doesn't matter. The debate in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe, was very much a link between the two. And the argument that the refugee crisis brought in was uncontrolled immigration, and among those refugees, asylum seekers were terrorists. And then really the only debate was then between the mainstream right mostly, but also left, that said among those 1.5 million asylum seekers, there are a few terrorists, to the radical right, which would say among those 1.5 million, there are a lot of terrorists. But the fact that there were terrorists among the asylum seekers and that the two were related, was perpetuated in the media. Again, very much playing on authoritarianism, because if that is the case, then, whoa, that means that immigrants are linked to crime, and which party always said that? The populist radical right. Finally, there was a populism aspect, and populism by and large means an opposition seeing society as ultimately divided between two homogenistic and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and wanting politics to be the expression of the general will of the people. And so the idea is that the people have one voice. The people are homogeneous. They have all the same interests and the same values. Similarly, the elite is one group, and they're all corrupt. Now, the populism came in through the European Union. One of the first things that came out was the refugee crisis was a crisis in part because countries no longer protected their own borders. Because of the Schengen Treaty, whomever got into Italy could get into Germany or could get into the Netherlands, right? And then Angela Merkel, in one of her few truly ideological moments, forced her Willkommenspolitik, or welcome politics, up in Europe. Whatever we think about it, and undoubtedly there's a lot of sympathy for that position, the way she did it was highly problematic. She made a statement of particularly suspending Dublin, but also saying that asylum seekers were welcome to Germany without consulting with other EU leaders, which meant that there was an incentive to come. And of course, not everyone stayed in Germany. Some went to the Netherlands as well. And I can assure you, my prime minister did not have a Willkommenspolitik. And so that created this idea that national elites betrayed the people to please the EU. So even the national politicians in Western Europe who had been critical about asylum seekers, like Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, in the end, under pressure from almighty Germany, gave in and chose loyalty to the EU over loyalty to the people, which is exactly that kind of populist narrative of some kind of transnational elite, cosmopolitan, distinct from the true values of the authentic people. So in that sense, the refugee crisis spoke exactly to the three core values of the populist radical right. And the narrative that was predominant in most of the media also played on many of those tropes. It's not to say that, on average, European media were populist radical right, but they would link the crisis to EU incompetence. They would link refugees to terrorism. And then the populist radical right could say, well, this fits within this larger theoretical framework. And so I think there were four key consequences of this whole process. And the rise of the populist radical right is possibly not even the most important. First of all, there was a rise of xenophobia at mass level. There was a surge in support for far-right parties, and we'll speak all four in more detail. There was a far-right turn of right-wing parties, and there was what I call the Orbanization of the European Union. So first, there was a rise of xenophobia. What we saw in 2015, later period, as well as 2016, and in some polls still 2017, is that immigration, as well as linked to security and terrorism, became the key concerns of the largest group of populations. Now, polls are very problematic. I can get various polls, and some will say that a majority is concerned about immigration, others a plurality, and others a minority. Depends on how you ask it, what the questions are before you ask it, the timing, all kind of things. But it is without a doubt that immigration shot up as at least one of the key issues of Europeans in virtually every country. Particularly, though, in Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, which never really had an immigration issue. What is important to note here is that it doesn't mean that people in Europe became anti-immigrant because of the so-called refugee crisis. They were already anti-immigrant. Central and Eastern Europe was deeply xenophobic well before any immigrants came. I looked at polling in the 1990s, and already Central and Eastern Europe was more prejudiced than Western Europe, including to groups that barely lived in the region. That wasn't new. What was new was that the issue gained salience. Immigration was a non-issue in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in Hungary, and became the top issue. And so, on the one hand, more people expressed anti-immigration sentiments, but more importantly, they found immigration to become the most important issue. Now, that is, of course, related to some of the other points. First, the rise of the far right. What you see in most cases here is the Front National, right, and it goes up. You see it in Denmark, the Danish People's Party goes up. Sweden in particular goes up. Germany, AFD, goes up from 2013, so let's say well before the crisis, to May 2016 or later, which is incidentally when the far right peaked. Now, when I'm talking about the far right, I'm talking about both radical right groups, which stay within the democratic order, and extreme right groups, because today we actually do have some extreme right parties which are by and large neo-fascist or neo-Nazi that are getting into parliaments. The most important ones are, of course, Golden Dawn in Greece and our Slovakia in Slovakia, which are both neo-fascist. We saw a rise, but what we also saw that they peaked in late 2016. And in 2017, the countries that had elections saw an increase in support for far-right parties, but it was lower than what they had polled in late 2016. So think about the FPÖ in Austria, which had a good result. It was actually not a historically good result, 27%. It had polled 27.6 in 1999, actually not just polled, it had gotten that in those elections. But they had polled in opinion polls around 35%, and as the biggest party in late 2016. Marine Le Pen had polled around 35% in late 2016, in the end got just over 20% in the first round of the elections. Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom, similar story, had polled around 25% at the end of 2016, in the end got about 13% of the vote. So what you see is that far-right parties in the polls shot up from mid-2015 to pretty much late 2016. And then in 2017 and 18 started to go lower. However, that low point in 2017, 2018 was still significantly higher than the high point in 2014, right? So there was an increase, and I would say roughly by 50%. Probably much more important is the far-right turn of mainstream right. And I recently tweeted this picture by saying that I hope that everyone one day finds someone who looks at you the way that Orban looks at Kurz. These two personify the far-right turn of mainstream right-wing politics in Europe today. This person I will talk about more, which I must admit is an obsession of mine. But I will explain why, and why it should be the obsession of pretty much anyone who is concerned about liberal democracy in Europe. This wunderkind, which he definitely is politically, is probably a more general phenomenon. There is an East-West component, but there are problems to that as well. Sebastian Kurz, interestingly enough, so he was Minister of Foreign Affairs at 27, I don't know how many years you guys still have, but think about that when you think that you're on the right track. 27, Prime Minister at 31. Interestingly enough, he didn't start out as Minister of Foreign Affairs with a very right-wing agenda. I heard from one colleague that he actually had a group of advisors together to create a more inclusive narrative around immigration and around multiculturalism. But when the refugee crisis hit, he redefined himself as the politician who could stop this. And he prided himself in having closed the Balkan route, which was the main route through which asylum seekers came, and campaigned on that not so much against the FPÖ, the far right, which he made clear he was willing to govern with, which was the SPÖ as well. But he had a new thing to sell. He didn't say the FPÖ is wrong or they're out of bounds. What he said is, they're on the outside shouting. I'm in the inside and I can actually take care of stuff. So you don't actually need the FPÖ. I can do this. I can do this much better because I'm a real politician. Of course, not an old-style politician. I'm a completely new type, competent politician, who takes care of immigration? Different example is Mark Rutte, other one I'm obsessed with, my own prime minister in the Netherlands, which in a recent interview Sebastian Kurz called his role model, which makes perfect sense. So what we have seen is throughout most mainstream right-wing parties a far-right shift, not simply by making immigration and social-cultural issues more important. That has happened over the last 2 decades regularly. But in the early 2000s, when many Bosnians came, there was also a call for a stricter immigration policy. And there was, in Germany and as a consequence in many surrounding countries, a revision of the asylum law. But the argument at that point in time was still, we have to do this to protect our multicultural society. And the metaphor was that you can't swap the floor when the faucet is still open, right? And so the idea was, if we close the faucet, we can actually mop the floor, and then we can drip a bit again, and we can keep mopping, right? Nowadays, the discourse in 2015 is fundamentally different. The discourse of Kurz, or of Rutte, or of Seehofer is multiculturalism is problematic. Immigration is threatening our national identity, which is the discourse of the far right. And so they now not only have taken over the issue, but also the framing of the issue. And as a consequence, the solutions to immigrations will have to be very similar to the solutions that the radical right has proposed, because they have pretty much adopted their analysis of the issue. This man is a different model where a mainstream right-wing party becomes radical right, fully, not just for elections. Today, Viktor Orban is the most powerful voice of the radical right in Europe. Since 2015, Fidesz, his party, which used to be a conservative party, before that even a liberal party, has become a radical right party. His speeches are almost identical to the speeches I read from the Republikaner in the 1990s. A similar party is Law and Justice in Poland, although it is not such a big player. To be provocative, a very similar argument can be made of CSU. The difference, of course, is that CSU is many different parties. The CSU is a party in Bavaria, and the CSU is a party in Berlin. Those are not the same parties. CSU has a very long history of adopting radical right programs to defeat radical right challengers. They did this already with the Republikaner, but we know that the CSU in power is always a bit different from the CSU in campaigns. And so, in that sense, there's a difference. But if you look at the rhetoric as well as the program of the CSU today, by the standards that we defined radical right parties in the 1990s, it would definitely be a radical right party. Now, why is Orban important? There's a major difference between Kaczynski, who is the leader of PIS, Law and Justice in Poland, and Viktor Orban, who is the leader of Fidesz in Hungary. Kaczynski is a Polish politician who has very little understanding of Brussels. Orban is a Hungarian politician, but he's also a European politician. Consequently, when PIS had problems with the European People's Party, the largest political group in the EU, the center-right group of CDU-CSU, and they started to criticize his right-wing policies, he said, I'm going. I don't need you, I go to another group where they're not so mean to me. Orban didn't, and it has paid off. because Orban is implementing not just a radical right state, but an illiberal state, in his own words, an illiberal state. But he's still a member of the European People's Party, a party that he was a vice president of for 10 years. He knows that party better than pretty much almost anyone else in that group. He still is protected by them. And in a recent interview, and the current situation is very, very important, he got re-elected. So he got elected in 2010, constitutional majority, got re-elected 2014, constitutional majority, got re-elected in 2018, constitutional majority, is rewriting the constitution. But in a recent interview, he has said that he wants to reshape the European People's Party pretty much into Fidesz's image, which means he wants to make the European People's Party a radical right party. And you see the effects. Not only does the European People's Party protect whatever Orban does, which is in part one of the new laws that just is currently being passed, which criminalizes support of immigration and immigrants. Illegal, but also legal. It slaps a 25% extra tax on NGOs that support immigration, people who actually help asylum seekers, which Hungary doesn't accept as being asylum seekers. They think they're illegal immigrants. You can go to jail. Sounds not really liberal democratic, but it's done within the EU. It's protected by the European People's Party. And this is in a country that, according to some calculations, has the highest subsidies from Brussels per capita. So it's not only that the European Union allows a regime that has values which the EU was founded to prevent, it actually subsidizes it. Without EU subsidies, that regime probably couldn't sustain itself. Right? And so it's doing that, but you can see the European People's Party shifting. One of the leaders of the European People's Party is Manfred Weber, who wants to be the Spitzenkandidat for the European People's Party, which would make him one of the most powerful people in the EU. And the new program of the European People's Party all talks about security, all talks about protecting Europe and European culture. It is a very clear shift towards Orban's vision of Europe. And so, while the European People's Party argues that it keeps Orban within the EPP to moderate him, when you actually look at what is happening, is that the EPP is not changing Orban, Orban is changing the EPP. And the power was the refugee crisis. And I will tell you an interesting story, which is completely forgotten. But just after the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attack, Orban also came to Paris. And Orban gave a speech which was more moderate than the speeches he has given since. By and large, it said multiculturalism has failed. We shouldn't have that. And this is what it leads to. He was considered an embarrassment. And he was criticized by everyone. Half a year later, we have the so-called refugee crisis, and it catapults Orban with a similar agenda to become the most important challenger of Angela Merkel. Let's let that sink in. A prime minister from a very poor country from Central Eastern Europe, which doesn't even have 10 million people, is the second most important politician within the European debate today, right? On the basis of a radical right agenda. That is, to a large extent, what the refugee crisis has done. And so, in conclusion, did it cause the rise of populism? Not exactly, But it did create a perfect storm for the radical right, and particularly radical right populists in Europe. In a short-term effect, it is a catalyst for support of far-right parties. Overall, they score about 50% better than before at this point in time. But it is important to remember that most of the successful radical right parties today were already successful radical right parties before the refugee crisis. Like FPÖ being the prime example, which was actually bigger in 1999, but Front National was already polling around 15%. Party for Freedom had a higher percentage before the refugee crisis than after. AfD is a different example, but AfD is not so easy, because AfD in 2013 didn't really campaign on a radical right agenda. And the question is, if they had, they might actually have done better. They would still have not done as well as in 2018, but they would have done better. 17, sorry. The short-term effect might indeed be that short-term, in the sense that this peak leads to the radical right going just lower and might even just go back again when we start to talk about other issues. The most important effect is the transformation of the European right wing, and as a consequence of European politics. And I think that is where we're going to see the true impact of the refugee crisis. It's not so much within the ENF, the political group of Marine Le Pen. It is within the EPP. And I will give you two scenarios. And I actually, a few weeks ago, I was talking to an editor of Politico Europe, which is an online magazine, about writing an op-ed about the upcoming 2019 European elections. And I was just being my nerdy self, getting all carried away about what effects Brexit would have on the political groupings, as well as recent trends. And I was thinking out loud for myself, and so I thought, okay, the European People's Party is going to be by far the biggest, because the center-left group of socialists and Democrats are losing Labour from Britain, and so they're going to implode. Social democratic parties are being hammered all across Europe anyway. At the same time, you have two groups in the European Parliament that are right-wing Eurosceptics that depend on British parties. European Conservatives and Reformists, they are linked to the Conservative Party. Once the Conservative Party is gone, that group is kind of gone, because the biggest party then is Law and Justice, which no one really wants to be dominated by. And the second group is Europe for Freedom and Direct Democracy, which is linked to UKIP, the right-wing populist party. So you have this whole space. We will have a lot of right-wing Eurosceptics, but they don't have a leader. There's one potential leader, which is Viktor Orban. And so I thought that was an interesting analysis, and turned out that was. And so the editor of Political Europe said, yeah, that's great. You should write that op-ed, because that clearly shows that the EPP should keep Viktor Orban inside. Because if they kick him out of the group, he could become the voice of a big right-wing Eurosceptic group. Which, of course, led me to say, then I will never write this op-ed, because that is not the lesson that I learned. But this is where it's at. At the moment, we'll have a struggle for the EPP between Merkel, for the sake of our argument, because there are not many others who still stand for a center-right agenda, and Orban, with the CSU in particular. If he wins, Orban wins, then obviously, fundamentally, Europe has changed. The largest group will now be a radical right-light group. If he loses, there's a fair chance that Orban will leave the EPP and start his own group, that group potentially could be the third biggest group. Even then, right, there will be an effect, but we will be back to a situation where there is a clear distinction between a radical right group and non-radical right groups. And so I think the struggle for the coming year or two is, was this a blip? Was this a short period where we all veered to the radical right and then we went back? Or is this truly the transformation of European politics, where the mainstream right becomes radical right light? And on that happy note, I will end.